Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Ger Spillane and I work for Focus Ireland. We're deeply honoured to be back again in your beautiful city and beautiful country. Thank you very much for the invitation. We're also honoured to be part of such a distinguished panel as well, and we thank you for your time. I've been asked to talk about PI, which is a psychologically informed environment. Unfortunately, public speaking has not created a psychologically informed environment for me, so I'm quite nervous. My nervousness normally expresses itself in that I talk, but I forget to move the slides. So you might, if I'm talking a lot and you don't see the slides moving, you might just let me know. Today you would have got a lot of information around PI, about ACE and stuff like that. So we're not going to go down that route. We're not going to talk about that. What we're going to talk about is our journey. Am I speaking okay? Am I too loud now? All right. Okay. So it's our journey, how we got here. And we started out with not knowing about trauma-informed care or not knowing about psychologically informed environment. But what we did know was that the current way in which we work with homeless people is not appropriate. It's not good enough. We need to do something else. But we had no framework in which to place that in. So we did a lot of kind of looking around, and we also, a challenge for us as well was that we needed to sell, the way we were thinking, we needed to sell trauma-informed care, we needed to sell psychologically informed environment to our statutory funders, to our staff, to other organisations. So how are we going to do that? Where was that information going to come from? So what we have done is we've broken our presentation down into the 5 key principles of PI, which is relationships, staff support, physical environment, psychological framework, and despite the fact Robin's best attempts to ruin my presentation by saying they no longer do number 5, we're going to go with it. I'm only joking. Expand it. So it's not in that chronological order. So where we started was from a cultural perspective. Where was there any time in Ireland where we had a system that supported the most vulnerable people in our community? Sorry, actually, I'm after messing up already. Just a brief overview of Focus Ireland and what we do. So we're a national organisation. We have over 400 staff. We provide a range of services right across. That's young people leaving care, young people in homelessness, housing first, drug addiction, drug treatment, psychological and psychiatric services, domestic violence, mental health projects as well. Our key thing is that we don't have any large buildings, so we don't provide emergency shelter in large buildings. All our properties, which is we have over 1,000 units of accommodation, are located in the community. So it's a community-based service. So we don't want to create homeless ghettos in cities or towns. We want to integrate people who are vulnerable back into the community in which they came from. So another key thing is homelessness is wrong. And that may seem like a fairly logical thing to say. But what has happened in Ireland recently is there is trying to be a normalisation of homelessness, that a certain percentage of homelessness is acceptable in society. And our view is it's not, that homelessness is wrong and it needs to be challenged. Our journey to PI, or our journey to trauma-informed care, began in the 7th century, which is quite a while ago. And this is the Brehon Law. Brehon laws are pre-Christian Irish laws, and they would have governed the laws of Ireland. Up until the 7th century, it was an oral tradition. After the 7th century, it was they were written down, they were transcribed. So why do we use the Brehon? We use the Brehon Law as a way of showing that the current status quo, or how we are currently treating vulnerable people, there is an alternative, and we had that alternative in the past. So if you look that under the Brehon Law, a person with a disability caused by a mental illness or an intellectual disability was known as a Dina Ladia, which is a person with God. Now, it's important in the Irish context that that is the highest accolade you can be given, to be referred to that. So that means that the most vulnerable in our society at the time were put at a priority, were put at the top. And every community and every extended family had a duty of care to look after the most vulnerable in society. And also, they also had to each family or each community had to provide a guardian to the most vulnerable person in society. And that is a protection factor. So if you look at adverse childhood experiences, which people have talked about already, one of the key things about adverse childhood experiences, or the antidote to adverse childhood experiences, is a protection factor. So your family or your parents may have been dysfunctional, but you may have had a functional aunt or uncle or grandparent who was able to go in there and provide that care, and that was the protection factors. Because what said to me a few times as well, some people experience trauma and some people experience the same type of trauma. Some end up in homeless services, some don't. Why is that? And it's largely down to the fact that they had a good community or support network around that, and that is what PI is trying to create. And also that there was a heavy fine, as you can see, labelled or levied. Also, the law was that whoever came to your door, irrespective of, you must feed and take care of them. It was not an offence to steal, if you were poor, to steal food or to take medicine. A person who witnesses a crime, which could be a crime that you don't help somebody who's vulnerable. It was known as Keen Sul, which is a crime of the eye. So not only you are as responsible for witnessing the crime and doing nothing about it as you are for doing it. So Brehon law places a high value on compassion, fairness, kindness, understanding, and empathy, which are all the elements of PI, or all the elements of how you should do in trauma, or how you should work in trauma-informed care. So it operated in Ireland up until the 17th century, and then from the 17th century onwards, attitudinal changes to the poor changed. So poor were blamed for being poor. They were criminalised for being poor. The poor were seen as morally deviant, morally weak. And society needed to protect society from that group of people. And what Irish society and what Irish culture did, and what Ireland did then, was they started to build large institutions, large psychiatric institutions. At the start, it was large prisons, because that's where you put people with mental health at the time. We built large prisons. We built homes for unmarried mothers. So if you were unmarried mothered, you were put into a home. I'll go into it. So that's Spike Island. It's in Cork. And up until very recently, at the start, if you were homeless, or if you were a vagrant, as it was called at the time, you were imprisoned. And that imprisonment usually meant that you were deported. You would either be sent to Australia, America, or the Caribbean as an indentured worker. So you were taken off the streets of Irish cities. We were under British rule at the time, but it was a standard practice right across the United Kingdom at the time, was that people would be, if you were poor or having a mental health, you would be imprisoned, and then you would be moved as an indentured slave to another part of the world. That's a Mandolin laundry. Mandolin laundries is where women who, their only crime, for want of a better word, was that they had a child outside of marriage. They were taken from their family home. They were put in Mandolin laundries, normally left there for most of their lives. They gave birth to their child in these Mandolin laundries. Their child was taken from them. In most cases, the child was sold or put up for adoption. Or majority of the children, they never saw their parents again. And currently, to this day, we have people coming back from America, from Australia, from New Zealand, from all over the world, coming back to find their birth mother, or where they came from. It's a huge scar, and it's a huge shame on our society that was allowed to happen. We also, children who were deviant were put into what is known as industrial schools. The horror so there was no aftercare, there was no childcare system. It was industrial schools, and the horror that was perpetrated on those children is practically unspeakable. Considerable amounts of physical and sexual abuse. So the point we're trying to make is this is what we're up against. This kind of idea that our society after the last hundreds of years went from being very compassionate to very caring to criminalising and punishing people because of their vulnerability. So we're using PI and trauma-informed care to return to our cultural roots, to where we started, to show that there is an alternative to what we're doing. And we're using that to dismantle over 400 years of societal dysfunction. So we're not placing any huge burden on PI. So we too have fundamental questions. In our own practice then, how are we going to create a service that best meet the needs of our client, and how are we going to create a service that best met the need, or allowed our staff to do that? In our relationships, Vinny and I would have worked in emergency shelters for most of our career. There was an awful lot of confrontation in those, an awful lot of fighting, a lot of very negative energy, a lot of anger, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma being expressed, a lot of trauma being created, a lot of trauma being reinforced. Staff and client stress going from one crisis to another, and little opportunity to take a breath or to centre yourself. But we discovered that not all teams and not all staff experience that. So we developed a model in terms of, so PI starts with me, it's the colleagues and your client. So what am I doing that's creating or that will promote a psychologically informed environment, or is not creating a psychologically informed environment? How does that influence my colleagues? And ultimately, how does that enable me to provide a service that's going to get my client or the person I'm working with out of homelessness? So in terms of, there was workers or project workers, as we would refer to them as, or there was staff in the services, and their responses were different. So what was different? Why was one staff having a very positive experience or able to manage their working relationship versus a staff member who wasn't, or finding it difficult to do so? So we developed a number of systems. So this was systems we developed ourselves, the talking therapy, or talking to our staff and talking to the clients that we work with. That was the key to this. But we looked at the type of environment. We looked at the physical environment. We looked at the frequency of the confrontational incidents. We looked at the number, the time of day it happened at, what staff interventions happened, and what staff were on shift. And we were looking for patterns. We're looking for themes in that. What was significant in that? And part of this then was that we spoke to staff through staff supervision, through debriefing sessions after shift. You would come in and you would talk about your experience, a kind of a mini reflective practice. And then we also had supervision, and then we had informal conversations with our staff. And we did exactly the same thing with our clients. So normally if you had a confrontational issue in the shelter, you were asked to leave. The client would be asked to leave. And when they came back, we would ask them, well, what was your experience of that? How did you feel at the time? How did you feel the staff responded to that at the time? So what we discovered was that staff themselves had a lot of unresolved personal trauma. And that staff were, as already mentioned, vicariously traumatized by the experiences of the people they were working with. And the key differences between staff was their attitude to the person. So we broke it down. So when we looked through all the information that we had, all the knowledge we got, all the data that we gathered, we looked at, and we've referred to it as PI and kind of anti-PI. So the staff who had the better relationship with the client, where there was less confrontation, where there was more positive outcomes, they showed these were the kind of the criteria or the elements in which they had in their practice. They were honest. They developed a relationship honesty, trust, and integrity. They had compassion. They were kind. They were empathetic. They had an understanding of where their client was coming from, and they were patient with their client. The converse of that was when the conflict kicked in, or when the client didn't feel that they were being respected enough. And what was there was that staff weren't able to create a trustworthy relationship. There was a coldness, there was an indifference to how the person had ended up in our homeless shelter. They were unsympathetic and they were impatient. Now, a lot of that has got to do with maybe a consequence of burnout. They didn't show unconditional positive regard, or conversely, they showed conditional positive regard. So what I will do for you is based on how you treat me or what your behaviour is at the time, as opposed to accepting behaviour, working with it and trying to work through it with the client. There was, as we say, unresolved personal trauma. There was also one thing that came up was, as Jung refers to it as the wounded healer. And I suppose the wounded healer is an interesting concept for in working with people in vulnerabilities, because Jung would say that it is the wounded healer, because of their psychological wounds, has the ability to be empathetic, that experiences. And Rumi would say that it's the wounds let the light in, and let us become, healers, or let us become, the person who's going to be the positive or the protection factor in that person's life. But my wife is a very wise woman, and I listen to her most of the time. And when I don't, I usually get in trouble. It's usually because I didn't listen to her. But she would say that you don't become a wounded healer automatically because you have wounds. You need to address, you need to address the wounds that you have. So therefore, we need to support staff to deal with their trauma, so that they can help support others with their trauma. So it goes back to relationships again. The expectation we have on staff is that they will be compassionate, that they will be empathetic, that they will be kind, that they will be patient, that they will show all those good traits to our clients. What we also need to expect is that our staff are ourselves, and pie always starts with yourself, and it goes out like a ripple in water. You need to show self-compassion, patience to yourself. You need to understand where you're coming from. You need to work on the issues that you have. If you can't self-care, how can you care for others? And that's a strong message we're trying to get across. So basically we need to build staff confidence. We need to support staff. And I just came across that image, and that image was powerful to me because every time it goes back to the adverse childhood experiences. Part of when we were doing that research at the start, what we discovered two things: that staff had personal trauma that they didn't have dealt with. And we also discovered that every person that we worked with had several adverse childhood experiences, that their pathway to homelessness or their pathway to vulnerability started as children. And that for us reflected in the need that then we needed to change our services in order to meet that need. And what we discovered was, through our work and through our with our clients, was that we might be sitting down in front of a 40 or 50-year-old man and woman, but when we worked through the issues, we were working with the 8-year-old or the 5-year-old child, going back that deep into the trauma and trying to resolve it from there. And that's it's an honest task on staff to have to do that, and that's why the staffing is so important, or staff training is so important. Sorry. So this is just the physical environment which we try to. I'm going to quickly go through this, but what it means, basically, what I'm trying to say here is that PI does not have to be this big, grandiose change in your organisation. You may not be in a position to make these big, grandiose. Like the ideal situation is the whole organisation becomes PI. But that shouldn't stop you from bringing PI into it in certain elements. So, like, for example, when I worked in emergency shelter, we would ask the people to leave at 10 o'clock in the morning, and they would come back at 7 o'clock at night. So you have 30 or 40 or 50 people, all full of drink and drugs, coming back to your shelter, looking for access. That is as far from a psychologically informed environment as you could possibly get. So what we created was an open access. So you could come and go as you please. What that meant was that people who didn't want to drink or wanted to take a break from it could stay in the shelter, could stay in their own room in the shelter and not want to go out, not be under the peer pressure to go out. It also meant that it broke up people's drinking and drug patterns. So, like, if you have nothing to do between 10 and 7 o'clock, and your life is around drink and drugs, that's all you're going to do, there's very little chance or opportunity for you to change. The main meal time was at 7 o'clock. So everybody came back drunk or on drugs, and then the food was that. So we changed it to midday. It broke the cycle. It broke the pattern of drinking and taking drugs. So you weren't. So it was a couple of hours. What it also did as well is that people didn't go out until after they had their meal. So people were going out hydrated. They were going out with a meal. They were going out, and it's just about, it's the small things. The small things can make a huge difference in your practice if you just take time to think about it. I mean, these are not huge things, but the significant difference that they made, both to the clients and to the staff, was amazing. The door of the shelter, that just told you, the expectation was that it was a large green door with a metal plate in front of it, and it was, we expect you to kick it in, so invariably that's what happened. So you changed the door. It reminded people of prison, right? That prison is not a psychologically informed environment. We don't want to replicate that. So you just change the door. You add brighter colours, You bring light. The best thing you can do in your practice is to bring natural light into your building, to brighten it up, to make people feel welcome. Because life is tough enough without you having to be constantly, as Dermot has already said, you take some of the stuff out of the way for you to be constantly be reminded of it. You'll be pleased. One thing I will certainly say is that space is hugely important in relationship when we're working with our clients. To allow the space to allow your staff, or in my case as the manager of the projects, is to allow my staff the time to create, develop a relationship with their clients. We don't have large emergency shelters. Everybody we work with has their own home. That's their space. They're in control of that. We refer to our clients as customers. And it's not, we don't use the word customer as an economic definition. We use it as a definition to define that you're our customer, we're there to serve you, we're there to support you. It's on us to provide you with a good service, not the other way around. And that's our goal that we strive for. So I think I've said enough for the moment. I'm going to hand you over to Vincent, but you'll be lucky to have me back again in a few minutes. Thanks for your time.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all. I would like to welcome you in Gaelic and the Irish language. I have spoken to the two ladies in the booth. They're okay. We're all cool about that. So, yeah. Oh yeah, okay. Okay. Céil mí le fáilte ród go léir, agus tá hanacharas, R&B on seo le Prague. Now, I'll translate now. 100,000 welcomes to you all here today, and I am delighted to be here in Prague. Thank you. Gur míle mágat. Okay. So, have you the clicker there? See that now? Just have to steal it. Thank you, sir. So, I'm going to talk about the physical environment and social spaces within a psychologically informed environment. And would you believe, here we go, some more Irish, okay? It's an old Irish saying, we've got loads of them. Irish people have lots of sayings, it's great. On ska a kila a varan the dena, under the shelter of each other, people survive. So, my name is Vinny, and like so many other people here today, I am a frontline worker. I work with Focus Ireland. I work with youth housing, so I will give you frontline experiences. We have found that working and key working, combined with the correct environment, is essential for a successful evidence-based outcome. Many of the people I work with believe that they have been part of a system, a structure, an environment that has judged them, and it has found them guilty of not being worthy. A system which puts up psychological and physical barriers. An example being, if a person goes to a government office, there is a glass screen. There is an area to speak through. This may be a physical barrier, but I see it as a massive psychological barrier to the person involved. That person then has to meet with someone who has a list of generic questions where there is no right, there is no wrong, there's no in-between, there's no alternative, to allow for trauma, for historical issues, past, present, and issues that those people are going through today. So in my mind, they have entered a physical environment, a social space, which they see as untrustworthy, cold, indifferent, impatient, and especially unsympathetic. To be met by staff who probably are not supported, who are not confident, and who don't actually feel safe themselves. This is a quote from a young man that I had worked with and I still work with. He said, "When I entered Focus Ireland office, I was greeted by another human being. He shook my hand. There was a sense of belonging. He did not consider me a person to judge for me exactly where I was coming from." The guy's called Mark. His nickname's Sparky. Everybody calls him Sparky. This guy was in serious addiction using benzodiazepine. He ended up in the streets. He is now living in a Focus Ireland home. He is doing an honours degree in University College Cork, and he's doing very well, and he has progressed. He's certainly changed his environment. Just move on here. Now, what I'm showing you now is I'm going to do this story in pictures, and I think it's probably best to do a lot of it in pictures due to the fact that I cannot speak the Czech language, and I probably can't speak the English language very good as well. So I think we'll stick to pictures and let the ladies translate, and it will all be cool. It'll be good, you know. Okay. So this is the Focus Ireland old office. This is the old office. Now, I don't know if you can see correctly, but there's bars on the windows. There's a security door. It's very dark. It's very frightening place. Now, that's the lane in which the old office was in. It's actually officially called Millard Street, but the older people in Cork, they call it Prostitute Lane. Okay? Now, they actually call it something else, but I would like to be invited back to Prague again, so I think my language should even out here. Okay. So if somebody gets a referral, okay, yeah, be cool. So if somebody gets a referral to go and see Vinny, they go to a building that's stone, has bars on the window, a security door, and it's in Prostitute Lane. So the psychologically informed environment is not good. So how did we bring about change? Well, my area manager, this Mr. Ger Spillane here, who was known as a very, very intelligent man, very intelligent guy, he got some money and he started a journey and he started to make change. And we acquired a premises. This premises is on the main street. This premises has got trees going up and down the main street. It's very bright, it's very open, and most importantly, it's easy accessible. This is the front door of the building. As you can notice, there's no bars and no barriers. Easy access yet again. And what we have here is the reception area. You may actually notice that in the reception area, it's quite colourful, it's open plan, and hopefully it's welcoming for people. As I said at the start, Kilmead Fulcher wrote 100,000 welcomes. We wished to welcome people, we wish to make it inclusive for all, and that is one of the changes we have brought about. One very quick grassroots story. A young boy, well, he's about 20, 21 now, that I have worked with for a good number of years. He, I suppose, adverse childhood experience. This is a very sad example, but it's a very, very good example. When he was 9 or 10, he came home from school one day and his mother told him to leave, to go away and not to come back. So the only place he knew to go was the school. And the teacher said, "School's over, go away, go home." But he said, "Sir, I am homeless." So he was put into state care, and I worked with him from he was 18. He came in one day and he was really angry. He was shouting. He wanted to talk to me, and I could see it in his face. I could feel the emotion. And then he started swinging. and he started swinging at me. And I thought, I can take this guy, no problem. Yeah. And then I thought, no, Vinny, you're an old man. You have lots of kilos and no hair. So I put my arms around him. Why did I put my arms around him? Because I had spent years building a good relationship with him. We respected each other. We basically liked each other as human beings, and most importantly, we trusted each other. We went into the side room, we sat down, we had a coffee, he cried, I listened, we spoke. Now, that was a couple of years ago. That young man now is living in his own home, he's living with his girlfriend, he has a full-time job, and he actually has a full-time contract, which I'm sure everybody knows is quite difficult to get. So he's doing very well, and I congratulate him. Okay, so these are just some pictures of the office, the new layout to show brightness, to show it being welcoming. Hey, here we go. That's actually a picture of me. We weren't allowed to put pictures of other people in. You'll know by my baldy head at the back that's me. So although we have private offices, they are still open. They are open with light, with brightness, to make them accessible and non-threatening to people. This is an area we have the back, and what we have sometimes is what we call participation days, where we invite people who use our service in, and they'll have a coffee, they'll have a chat, and we'll maybe organise days out or trips. So we use that area for that purpose. Now, this is an example of one of our flats. We basically like to keep the flats at a high standard. We actually are very happy to keep them open, to keep them fresh, to make sure that they're kept very clean and encourage the people to do so. Because sometimes it is put out there, anywhere will do for somebody like you, Well, we are all equal, we should be all equal, we are all the same. And with the wrong environment, people will not progress, they will not prosper if they aren't given that opportunity and that chance. This is just another example of the flood. So I'll talk now about staff support and training. There's a combination of supports that staff have in Focus Ireland. One is supervision. One is facilitated reflective practice, a very important piece of pie. Independent, confidential counselling. I will stop there. And I think to do my job correctly today, I need to explain to people like yourselves who are workers, who are frontline workers, who understand. How am I going to explain this to you without giving you a proper real-life example? And that's what I've decided to do, because PI is about everybody. It's about environment, it's about people, it's about the staff member, it's about the person using the service. It's about a combination of issues, not just one issue. So, I come from a very large extended family. And January this year, a very close relative of mine took a massive overdose. They committed suicide. They took their own life. So it was a very traumatic experience. I internalized it. I suppressed it. I oppressed it. I put all the emotion down inside me. We buried our family member. I did not cry. I was strong. I had solidarity with them, and I showed no emotion. I left Belfast. I went back to Cork. That Monday morning, I was in work about 30 minutes when I heard a voice. A young boy who I recognised, who I've been working with. He wanted to speak to me. So I said, no problem, speak to me. He said, I didn't know if you'd be here, Vinny, but I thought I would call today before I went away. And I says, well, where are you going? He says, I'm going to the river. I'm going to commit suicide. Now, inside me, I felt I had just buried my relation. I was back into work. I cannot cope. I cannot deal with this. But I thought about my options, my alternatives. And the alternative and the option was that that young man would take his own life. So we remained calm. We got the help. Long story short, that young fellow now is well. But this is where the story really starts. I was able to use supervision to express my concerns. I was able to use reflective practice within the PI structure to get advice and support from my colleagues, and I was given the number of a counsellor to go and speak to about my issues. Nobody asked me about the price of it, how much it cost financially. Nobody spoke about it. I was offered it by Focus Ireland. So there's 3 things, if you want a real-life example of how the structure and system works. It supported me to support others. So, as well as that, we have educational grants, as Focus Ireland sees education by its staff as an investment in the organisation, and a comprehensive training programme. Right, there's a lot here, and I don't really have the time. So basically, staff support and training within the organisation is harm reduction to help you work with people, supervision as stated, addiction counselling, neurobiology of addiction, motivational interviewing, pizzazz, as Robin spoke about earlier, trauma-informed care, mental health first aid, case management, therapeutic crisis intervention, and brief intervention assessments. Now, I do not have the time to speak about all of this, but I'll actually speak about trauma-informed care, because trauma affects us all, and we must deal with that trauma to leave ourselves in the position we are able and capable to support and help others. Now, support for clients. We like to support the client in the home to maintain their tenancy, allow them access to medical, psychiatric and addiction services, access to psychologists, tenancy support for as long as it is required. And the 2 things I would like to speak about is education and access to personal development. I was told by the Educational Training Board one time that people could go into courses and move themselves from step 1, step 2 to step 6. But I informed them some of my people were at -2 and I wanted to get them to 0. I wanted to get them to 1. So at the minute I have 12 of the young people I work for attending 3rd level education. One person is doing a master's degree. I think this is a great achievement for the people. Within Focus Ireland, I run and organise a study class. This study class, I have started to create a system where it is peer-led. A young person, or any person, who has done, for example, an undergraduate diploma and is now doing a degree, they can facilitate the class and assist and support. Also, personal development. It's part of a journey. It's up to me within my project, it's up to us as an organisation, it's up to all of the organisations to work together to empower people. So hopefully within our organisation, we have changed structure, we have changed course. But I'll leave you with this. What I really believe is that workers like yourselves, workers like me, if you don't look after yourself, you cannot look after others. Thank you so much. Gur mille mágat.
I'm back. We're onto the home stretch now. I suppose just to... There's a green light anyway. So. PI, or the implementation of a psychologically informed environment, and tying that up with trauma-informed care is hugely important. We're nervous in the sense that we're kind of fearful that we're not going to get across to people how important it is, or the huge positive consequences that developing a psychologically informed environment and a trauma-informed care can have on both staff and on our clients. As I say, when we started on our pathway, we didn't quite know what we were doing, and it was great to talk to Robin about it, because, and it's obviously great to come to, obviously to the Czech Republic. It's always great to come here, but it's great to come and meet other people who have like mind. It was great to hear about from Radek this morning as well, and that trauma, that the thinking isn't independent. that there's lots of thinking, lots of people looking at different ways of doing stuff, and bringing this together today and sharing those ideas is fantastic. And we hope we've it is our personal experience. There is cultural nuances that may not be applicable, but we hope you've got something out of this. Part of why Pi and Robin became so important to us was that, when we had spoken to our clients and when we had spoken to our staff and when we had got a deeper understanding of trauma and a deeper understanding of what we needed to provide with staff and how we needed to work with our client group, it was difficult for us to find a framework or a vehicle in which those changes could be made. So, how are we going to use all the information we had as a vehicle for change? Where was the framework in which we could conceptualize the information we had, or the knowledge that we had, or the practice experience we had? And then, of course, how were we going to promote the good practice within that and support staff out of the bad practice? Because that's vitally important. You need to show compassion and empathy to your staff as well if they're experiencing burnout or... so it was to promote the good practice and to challenge the poor practice. We needed to set it to staff, we needed to set it to the organisation in which we worked for, and we need to set it to our funders, largely, our statutory funders. And thankfully, Pi gave us that ability to do that and gave us a conceptual framework for that. So that's hugely important. Speaking to Robin, he gave me a quote from Ray Middleton, which was hugely comforting, because you'd be, standing up here talking about Pi with Robert Johnson is like standing up and explaining Catholicism with the Pope in the room. You're under a bit of pressure to get it right. And we would always have seen housing first or Pi or trauma-informed care or whatever. These are vehicles in which we can get into, but it's where we drive them to is what's important. It's how we use them. And I think if we become too hard and fast in worrying about how are we doing this right, are we not doing it right, we get bogged down in stuff and we miss the whole point of this. Pi is a very simplistic approach. Trauma-informed care, it's treat people how you would like to be treated. For my practice, I think of my two sons. I love my sons. They're the most important people in my life. I'm not always going to be there for them. And I'm not going to be able to control what happens in their life. And if my sons end up in a homeless service, or they become addicted, or they have a mental health problem. And it was interesting because we talked about genetics earlier today. And I remember reading a report one time that a third of the population has a mental health problem that will never surface until you use narcotics. And that's an interesting thing. So I don't know, so going back to my own family, I don't know that. But all I know is, or all I can do, is create a service or provide or influence the organisation to such an extent that I would be happy that if my children were ever in trouble, I would be happy for them to come to the organisation I work for and knowing that they would receive the support that I would expect. That kind of keeps me on a straight and narrow. It's a very important thing I keep in my mind all the time. It's why I do the work I do. How can I better things? How can I make society better? How can we treat people better? Because we see the waste of human potential. And what's most frustrating about seeing the waste of human potential is that there are so many options open to us to prevent that from happening. And that's what we need to focus on. So just to go back then, we're in a stage now. Sorry, I have a bit of a cold on me. We're in the stage now where we're kind of in the adolescent stage, I suppose, of developing Pi and trauma-informed care, and we're finding it very difficult to distinguish between the both. So we've just stopped trying. So Pi was introduced as a pilot in 2012. It became an organisational it became right across the organisation in 2016. We introduced trauma-informed care to our youth housing project. Now, our youth housing project, which we would have spoken about here last year, works with young people who are leaving care. That project was set up because in my previous job with Cork Simon, I would have had to go to coroner's court or death reviews. And the majority of young people who left care ended up in homeless services. If they didn't have an addiction, well, within 6 months they had a full-blown addiction, and the consequences of maybe between 12 and 18 months later, I was at their coroner's court, listening to how they died. And I felt at the time like there needs to be a better way of doing this. This needs to stop. We can't be, it's unethical, it's immoral to be working in this environment and not see that as being wrong and not doing something about it. And again, it goes back to what I was saying. You don't have to do the grandiose stuff. Just small changes in your practice. It ripples out like when you throw a pebble into the water. It ripples out, it's concentric. It influences other staff. It eventually becomes part of the organisation. And we need to take risks as in our jobs. We need to push the boundaries of the people that we're working with within the organisation. I always think back about the Brehon Law, where it was the law to look after people in your society. Wouldn't it be wonderful to work in a country, I'm talking about Ireland now, where that the government were not only required by law, but culturally obliged to do all they could to help the poor rather than penalise them. So we've adopted housing first as a core principle. So in our organisation, we were working in different ways. So all our projects now are deemed housing first. And our key strategy, our organisational strategy, is prevention and sustained exit. Best way of dealing with homelessness is stop it in the first place. So that's prevention. And that's where we need to work with children and work with young adults. We need to minimise the risk or the trauma or the reinforced trauma that the ACEs have placed on them. And then once we get people out of homelessness, they stay out of homelessness. So Vinny's work, this year would have 12 young people who have gone to University College Cork this year, who have started degrees, who, if it wasn't for that intervention, would never have had that opportunity. So that's what we benchmark it on. And our goal is not to manage homelessness, which is what large shelters do. They contain it, they try to manage it, they don't solve it. Our goal is to solve it, to end it. So that just goes back to that. Like the trauma-informed care came from our ACE, or our youth housing project. And then we had a therapeutic service for families. So TIC was used for young people, and the PI was used for families. And now our goal is so our next step is to embed this into our organisation. And how we propose to do this is that we're going to use we're going to create psychologically informed environments, and that's what's going to influence the structure. So that's rules. I think Robin referred to it earlier about rules and how rules are applied. And one of the key things we would have found when a confrontational situation exists is that staff, where staff had a positive outcome, they were flexible with how they applied the rules. Where they had a negative outcome is where they held fast to the rules. There needs to be a conversation. There needs to be flexibility in how we work. So we're going to use PI as the overall structure. And that even goes down to how we as managers work, how the organisation in general works, how we treat our staff, how we talk to our staff, how we create staff. And I don't know if we got it across, but I think it's important we get across that reflective practice for us is huge. So reflective practice, so Vinny would go to reflective practice. My management group goes to reflective practice as well. And we talk about our practice, and we talk about how we're talking about how are our actions with our staff. It's our responsibility to ensure our staff create a psychologically informed environment. If they're not doing that, then what is our role in that? And then trauma-informed care is how we deal with the person, how we talk to the person, our attitude. And 80% of how we communicate with somebody is through our body language. You know, there's very little done through words. So we have to be very conscious of that and our attitude, you know. And in my experience, vulnerable people or homeless people are very clued in to body language and very clued in and can read you and know when you're, there's a word I'm going to use, but like Vinny, I want to come back to Prague. They know when you're not being honest, when you're not being upfront with them. And that's why it's important that attitude. And your attitude can be challenged within the reflective practice. And you're not being challenged or pulled up by your manager. You're being pulled up by your peer. You're being challenged by your peer, and vice versa. And that's a hugely learning experience. But again, you have to be honest and open enough and big enough to be able to deal with that. So how do you know you have a PI service? And this was from the homeless organisation, or homeless org that Robin would refer to earlier as well. So people with complex needs are not excluded. And that's certainly the case. We can say yes to that. We do not exclude people with complex needs. And we've continued to work with people with complex needs. It's actually ironic that since we started the Housing First, before we started the Housing First, our referrals come from the statutory agencies or the government agencies. And they would have said to us, well, will you be able to work with these people? They're really difficult to work with. They're really hard. You know, they've got chronic mental health, chronic addiction problems. Are you willing to work with them? I said, of course, yeah. So they referred them. We took them in. We housed them. 3 months later, they're still in their house. They're maintaining their tenancy. And our statutory comes back to us and say, yeah, well, maybe they weren't quite as complex as we thought they were. Maybe we need to give you harder people to work with. And rather than accept the fact that PI works or that Housing First works, they prefer to take it on that, oh, actually, we didn't give you the hard enough cases in the first place, but now we're really going to give you hard cases. And the reality of the situation is, it's always worked. Now, it takes time, that is, and also that failure is not a word we use. If it doesn't work out, so how we work, so if you're in an apartment and it's not working out for you there, we move you to another one. We change the environment in which you're in. You will never go back, or the plan is that you will never go back to homeless services, or you will never go back to sleeping on the street. And I think that's crucial. Staff are trained and supported to recognise and work with the behaviour and emotional issues they present in terms of their unmet psychological needs. You can't say yes that that's happening, because for us that's ongoing. That needs to continue. If we ever got to a stage where we said, yeah, we've that done or ticked that box, then I think we might have missed something. It's an ongoing process. It's something you need to keep an eye on all the time. And staff are given time to reflect together in order to develop an understanding of their own and their clients' psychological needs and the relationship between the two in the work that they do, and that's vital. And that's why we would promote own home as opposed to congregated settings, because that gives the space as well. You know, somebody can go back into their own home where they feel safe, and they can think about what you've said to them. They may not like what you have said with them, or you may have had a confrontational situation with them, but that will continue to fester if you're both in a shelter. It will not continue to fester if there's space. If they can go back to their home, and you can go back to your office, and that's key. So in terms of outcomes, what have our outcomes been since we implemented PI and since we've gone down that route and since we've worked at Housing First? Our outcomes is that we would have a 97% tenancy retention. So that's 97% refers to the first tenancy you're given. So those 3%, anything that's not 100% there, those other percentages are not forgotten about. That 3% is either rehoused somewhere else or there's another type of intervention from the assessment that's put in place so that the next time it becomes successful. And that's quite the criteria of Housing First. If you look at Housing First has an 80% success rate the first time around. And there's a 60% success rate for that 20% who don't make it the first time around. And you know, you just need to keep working at it all the time. Outreach. What we mean by outreach is that that's people who don't have who are not living in Focus Ireland properties, but are either in the private rented or local authority housing, or council housing, or government housing. Of the people we work with in terms of preventing, we have a 96% success rate. And to give this into figures, we would work annually with over 15,000 families and individuals a year. So it's quite a significant. That's nationally, and we would that would be our success rate, and that's our benchmark. We're not happy with those figures, by the way. Just to let you know, we believe that it should be 100%. There should be the mechanisms and tools in place to make this permanent. And the decrease in number of confrontational incidents. So, for example, when I worked with several organisations, and I've worked in many emergency shelters, and both Vinny and I would have experienced confrontational incidents going from verbal up to fatal, and we would have witnessed that, and we would have had to work with that, and we would. I suppose when we were in the shelter, it would be a good day in the shelter if you didn't have, like, say, maybe 2 or 3 confrontational incidents every few hours. So every 2 hours, every 3 hours, constant aggro. Since we moved away from the congregated setting, when we created the space to allow relationships to develop, when we created a space that this is your home and this is my office, and we talk to each other somewhere in the middle and we head off to our respective areas. When did I start? 2012, that was it. So since I started in Focus Ireland in 2012, we've had 2 confrontational incidents in our office. That's an office with open plan. That's an office with no barriers. That's an office that people can just walk in off the street. And that really shows how the environment affects how we work with people, or how people respond to that. And they're exactly the same people who I would have met in the emergency shelter, who would have been very confrontational, who would have been very aggressive. And the environment has changed that. Not only has the environment changed it, but implementing psychologically informed principles has changed it too. And you'll be pleased to know that's me finished. And right on time, eh?
Děkuji, výborný čas. Tak. Já poprosím, aby si naši lektoři vzali sluchátka a je čas na diskuzi. V publiku už jsou připraveny 2 dámy, které vám podají mikrofony, tak prosím, jestli máte někdo první otázku. Necháme ještě nasadit sluchátka a připravit se. Tak já pokud zatím nevidím nikoho v publiku, tak moje první otázka, jestli si můžu dovolit, tak by směřovala na všechny lektory. Já mám zkušenost, že v mnoha institucích, ve kterých se potkávají s traumatizovanými lidmi, mohou to být dětské ústavy, psychiatrické léčebny, tak je spíše tendence zpřísňovat pravidla a podmínky právě proto, že se třeba personál může těch klientů i bát. A neustále se zmiňují různé třeba násilné incidenty a ty odůvodňují, proč jsou přísnější pravidla a mříže na oknech a tak dále. Jak se vám podařilo změnit tohle uvažování toho samotného personálu, který často vlastně buduje sám ty bariéry vůči klientům, protože se jich bojí? A tento přístup je postaven na tom, že se nemá bát nikdo. Ani klienti, ale ani ten personál. Jak se jakoby podařilo změnit tadyhle tu myšlenkovou bariéru, kterou může mít i někdo z personálu? A klidně ráda vás poprosím všechny, jestli třeba můžete říct nějakou svoji zkušenost.
Hello. Well, for myself, I probably have the luxury of being able to work with people for maybe a slightly longer period of time than I used to be able to do. So that would give me, I suppose, time to be diversionary, to be preventive, to, I suppose, investigate a lot of the problems and concerns that they had and try and address them in a partnership manner. Now, I do understand that isn't crisis intervention, but I'm giving an example of my project and how I work and how to try and create and build a relationship, build mutual respect over a certain period of time. And I suppose it boils down to how you treat the person. End of.
Cool.
Sure.
Yeah, I suppose the key thing in PI is building the relationship and allowing your staff the time and flexibility to build that relationship. That's the key. Not all organisations may have the luxury to do that, but it certainly does make a huge difference. Also, rather than making dramatic changes, you can, if there's a particular, like what we've done, we have, say, youth housing, our youth housing project, which deals with very complex needs, young people. That would have been the only kind of PI or trauma-informed care project we would have run. So we would have used the success of that project to change the other projects. So as I say, it's not a grand, huge organisational change. You use pilots, and you get staff buy-in by saying, we'll do this for 6 months. And of course, you don't mean that, but you're given the pilot. You're running just that project on these principles. If it works there, we can move them out, and that's it. Yeah, incremental. Yeah.
Cool.
I think that it depends on the institution, if I can put it that way, that to some extent small is beautiful. It is ideal if a person has their own home. That's the best. When a person is stably housed, that's the best environment from which to work with them. Where that's not possible, I would certainly advocate smaller temporary residential services, smaller shelters. When you have a large shelter, as we have, there are actually 2 of them in Cork City, and there are probably 30 or 40 in Dublin. When you have a large shelter, especially one which is both open access and trying to provide ongoing support for people, it becomes that bit more difficult. But what I've found in terms of the changes that we've brought around from a trauma-informed perspective is that the organisational philosophy, the organisational values are a strength and a resource for staff that and our volunteers, that people very much buy into what we're trying to do, and the willingness to take risks and the willingness to make changes is tremendous, and the willingness to spend time sitting down and exploring what we can do better is absolutely enormous. So I think that there is a lot of flexibility. There has been an awful lot of improvements over the years, but you're working with larger shelters in particular. You're working with a structure and an approach that's not fit for purpose, and that's always going to be challenging. And it's interesting hearing Ger talk about his experience in shelters, including in our own Cork Simon shelters, that the element to which it is a journey, that changes have been made constantly every year, year after year, looking again at what we can do to make the environment better for people. But it is difficult, because what we want to do and what we need to do strategically is move to a situation where if people have to stay in shelters or shared emergency accommodation of any type, that is in the very short term, for in the region of 9 to 10 days, rather than for weeks, months and years, as is currently the case. So that's why I mentioned the importance of strategic planning and the importance of involving the people you support, as well as staff and volunteers in doing that planning. And if you work together with people, and if you have debates about issues, and if you don't have too much of a top-down command and control approach to how you run services, you're much more likely to get buy-in and innovation for positive changes that do very definitely have positive benefits. But it's like Sisyphus, you have to keep rolling the rock up the hill.
Okay, so the question is, how do we encourage and support staff to respond creatively to challenging behaviour? Mm-hmm. Yes? When we were first writing about trying to answer this question, what does a psychologically informed environment look like? Some of my colleagues were saying, well, it's important to be fair, it's important to be consistent, and it's important to be clear so that people know where they stand. There's security in that as well as fairness. And others were saying, we want a person-centered service. So we will have to be flexible because everybody will respond differently, will react differently, they will need a different response. So consistency is good, flexibility is good. So I am not going to say to you, this one is what you should do. I'm not going to say in every situation this is the proper approach, or in every setting. What I would say is you must think about it. You must discuss with your colleagues what is right and what is the range of responses that might be right for you. This is why responsiveness is one of the themes in the new model. What I would say, though, is that all the experience we have suggests that introducing reflective practice is probably the fastest and most effective way to get the staff on board in whatever change, because the changes you introduce will come out of their thinking. Not thinking that you impose on them, but they thinking, how could we do this differently? The trauma-informed care and PI are both very holistic models. And sometimes I think it doesn't matter where you start, because all these things will feed the other. And I think you should choose which of these ideas and which of these elements is where you're at. But if you're not sure, and in particular if you want to bring the staff on board with you, I would recommend starting with introducing reflective practice. Some people I know are very threatened by reflective practice. They expect it to be a way that management will catch them out, will show how wrong they were, will develop a more sort of punitive and blaming culture, which is the opposite of the culture of inquiry. But you don't have to start in your reflective practice sessions with looking at what went wrong. Most people assume, we need to look at how we handled a problem. You could look at what went well. You could start off introducing a reflective practice culture by looking at where your strengths are. You want the clients to look at where their strengths are and work with them. Why not start with honest discussion of where your strengths are as well as your weaknesses? But reflective practice, I think that's the way to get people on board. Yep.
Thank you. Nějaká otázka? Tady.
Děkuji za prezentace. Mám takové dvě otázky, které se hodně týkají samotného personálu a jakým způsobem se všechny ty změny zavedené projevily na míře jejich vyhoření. To se asi bude týkat hlavně Cork Simon, který si teda pravidelně vlastně vyhodnocuje míru vyhoření u personálu. A jakým způsobem se tyhle ty změny taky projevily třeba na počtu odchodů personálu v průběhu let?
We have quite a degree of stability in terms of the staff teams. The organisation has grown over the years, but we've retained staff, and on the whole, we have a very committed staff team. In terms of the first part of your question regarding trauma and burnout and how you deal with it, we introduced targeted reflective practice for the evening teams, because we analysed all of the types of incidents that were experienced in the shelter environment, and the majority of them happen in the hours between, say, 7 p.m. and 1 a.m. We've brought in we first of all brought in a shift coordinator, and then we recently replaced that with 2 team leaders working 4 days on and 4 days off, so there's always a team leader on duty. That's been hugely welcomed by staff and has given a solidity to the team and had a very positive impact on staff morale. But that can get knocked back as well, and I want to emphasise again how it's a constant piece of work that you have to keep going back to, because we had some difficult situations. We had an incident where a very well-known and liked service user died outside the building. That caused a lot of trauma, because it was reported wrongly, as it turns out, in the media that person had been turned away from the service. And more recently, you know, we've had another incident recently where a person staying in tents, who was again well known to some of our staff, was murdered in the city, and that upsets things quite a bit. So you have to keep revisiting, and you never have the problem solved. You constantly have to put supports in place. But it's also a very dynamic situation with homelessness in Cork, with the number of people becoming homeless increasing at a faster rate than the services can expand to meet the needs. And that brings in additional pressure. We have been looking at the issue of burnout because it's indicated in the research. And we only last week I was meeting with the health services talking about a particular form of clinical supervision, which I think gets a mix between the type of reflective practice that we're already using, which is independently facilitated and works with groups of five and six people, and clinical supervision. So this is where you just take 2 to 3 staff members with somebody using a mix of cognitive behavioural therapy and stress reduction techniques to work intensively with people to deal with the ongoing stress, and we're hoping to bring that in next year. Where people engage with that, it definitely produces positive benefits. As well as that, we do encourage people to take up we, like Focus Ireland, have free counselling available to staff, and when people are particularly involved in a particular trauma, whether it's in their personal lives or whether it's something that happened at work, it's very important that they take that up. But we've also realised that not everybody is into talking therapies, and we're looking now at extending that to include other kind of things like physiotherapy. An awful lot of people manifest their stress by developing pains in their backs and shoulders and necks, and would far prefer an hour of physical therapy than an hour of counselling. So we're looking at those kind of supports as well. So I think we're making progress incrementally, but because life is ever changing and shit happens, as the Buddhists say, because of that, you will get knocked back from time to time, and you have to have your eyes on the prize and keep moving forward.
Děkuji. My máme dva otázky ve slajdu. Tak první je na Gera. Zda využívají nebo plánují využít v praxi human-centered design a jeho proklientské metody. Nevím, jestli na takovou panelovou diskuzi to vůbec není rozsáhlé téma a zda to spíš není na nějakou individuální konzultaci. A druhá otázka zní, že tady zaznělo opakovaně, že úspěch je skryt v drobných změnách. Jestli nám panelisti můžou říct každý jednu konkrétní drobnou změnu, která odstartovala ty velké změny. Tak nevím, jestli i ty metody zvládneme, anebo jestli se budeme věnovat jenom změnám. Start.
I can say a little bit about a minor change that was very profound. We brought Sam Sembers of Housing First over to train our staff, and he did a half-day session with every group of staff, and immediately, sometimes, you want to bring changes and you discuss ideas, and we were all familiar with Housing First, we were already committed to the model. But having somebody come from outside and they see things that you don't necessarily see, certainly somebody as experienced as Sam Sembers, and he was able to identify in a very skilled way a strand of paternalistic thinking that existed in the organisation, where we felt responsible and therefore also in control of decisions that people make that aren't necessarily our responsibility. And that just crystallised some thinking and some discussions that had been going on for a long time in terms of, if you do this or if you do that, are you setting up somebody to fail? If you really believe and if you really respect the people you work with, that they're living their own lives and that their choices matter, then you can't take responsibility for those choices from people, but rather you have to engage with people on a side-by-side basis rather than a top-down basis. And immediately after that, people in our high support houses started changing their practices, such as withholding and handing out people's medications, let people manage their own medications, and in quite a variety of other ways. So what was only a half day's training led to it was as if the change in philosophy, and I think all Irish voluntary organisations to some extent have founders who are deeply embedded in the Catholic Church, are in the strongly Catholic environment of Ireland, which, to say the least, was extremely paternalistic. But the society had been changing, and with this bit of training, a tipping point was reached, and it was like the floodgates opened, and people felt that there are different ways we can do things, and people started talking at their own team meetings. What can we do to give back more power to our residents and service users? So that's just one that comes to mind.
Thank you. Maybe some other.
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah. As a manager or as trying to lead a particular part of the organisation, you need to develop a trust with your client group, but also with your staff. Staff need to trust that you are doing the right thing, the right motivation for it. And largely to get a big buy-in, it's better to start small. Start small, or aim small, miss small. And so you build up the trust by bringing in the small changes at the start. And once that trust is developed, and once staff can see that there is a positive outcome for this, the organisation is likely to take on larger changes. It's also important to be open to the fact that if the change is not as successful as you thought it was, that there's flexibility in terms of being able to make changes or to adapt the change you want to meet the environment. Every change we make has to be for the benefit of our client, and that's the benchmark. And if it's not, then it's not working or it's not useful. To go back to the first question, if that's okay, about models. Perhaps I'm wrong to say this, but I'd be wary of models or trying to adapt something. My basic model is my service meeting the needs of the people that are coming to it? And if it's not, and Pi was a very useful model to use because it gave a framework and it conceptualized what we wanted to do. And Housing First is the same. But in reality, they were things we were doing already. We just didn't have a language for it, as Robin has already said. So I have a bit of an issue with Housing First and fidelity to Housing First. I have an issue with kind of a lot of fidelity to a lot of models, principally because if you get caught up in fidelity, you may lose the purpose of what you were trying to do in the first place. So the model or the rules of the model become more important than the person you're trying to work with. And if that happens, then, you can have all the models in the world, but they're useless if you're not meeting the needs of the person that you're working with. Does that make sense?
Okay, we are asked for an example of one small thing. I'll give you two examples, in fact, and they're quick. But before I do, I'm so bad at this. I'm not good at promoting my ideas. I'm always amazed that people have heard of this. My presentation this morning should have ended with a final slide. And that final slide is the link to the website that I've developed over 5-10 years, which has a huge amount of information on Pi's examples, research, questions, videos, cartoons. Got some good cartoons. If you can write down www, of course, PiLink, which is PIELINK. So link, Pi and
Já myslím, že ho máme i v těch materiálech.
Michael's got a job.
.net. So there.
They need to press the button there.
Oh, okay. I'm just about to put there a very short article. It's maybe 4 paragraphs. I've been trying for 3 years to get the managers of a support service in Scotland to write up, to put in writing, a story they told me about how they put a small window in the front door so that as people walk up at night time and the door is closed for security, anybody arriving can make eye contact immediately with the staff in the office. As soon as there is eye contact, there is a personal relationship. The difference that it made in putting a small window in the door, they can then calculate in terms of the reduced number of incidents, the reduced staff sickness. They can quantify the difference this tiny change made. Another example is a long-term supported housing unit. That's long-term meaning maybe 2 years for people with complex needs. They have night staff who are awake by night. And the night staff used to sit in the office so that they could be available. After a Pi training course run by a colleague of mine, they decided to close the office at night time. And instead, the night staff sit in the social room, the TV room. They're just out of the office and amongst everybody else. Again, they identified a massive reduction in the demands on staff, a massive reduction in the number of challenging behaviour incidents, and a reduction in staff time on sickness. It costs nothing to close the office at night time. I know another service, I'll give you a third example. Another service used to have a room for counselling sessions. This is a youth homelessness services. A lot of kids had a lot of difficulties. They had staff around who would have one-to-one key worker sessions. They closed the office, and now they have the key worker sessions in the coffee bars. There's no confidentiality in a counselling session in a coffee bar, but there isn't in the real world. That's the world that we want our youngsters to live in. And so that's what they're preparing for by closing their confidential areas. It costs nothing.
Děkuji.
Sorry, just a short comment. I work within my own project, and I could feel very happy if I'm treated as a worker within a social structure and not within a corporate structure. Because if I was to be treated within a structure that is non-egalitarian and unjust, it would send a strong message to me as how would that filter down to the servers, users. So a social structure to hear my needs, my wants, my concerns, and let me have my say is something very important to me and something I would hold dear, advocate and promote. Thank you.
Děkuji. Já bych si teď dovolila diskuzi ukončit a přesuneme se na svačinu tam tím směrem. Sejdeme se zde v 15:10 nejpozději, prosím, a mezi tím poprosím ještě české panelisty, že vyměníme diskutující a připravíme se. Děkuju.
Out for a fag.